Yeah. Well, and you're probably saying, he was wearing that in the last video, wasn't he? Yeah, I am. Anyway, emotions. Oh man, I tell you what, I had a nickname when I was younger, and that was Mr. Aloof. Part of it was because I stayed away from emotional anything because to me they were, I don't know, scary is the right word. It hurt. I would get jazzballed, and then I couldn't think, couldn't do anything, but it was paralyzing in a lot of ways. So along the way of healing, while I would be laying there tremoring and stuff like that, I began to realize something, and that was I was feeling a lot of stuff. And I got to a point where, and it's not in the scary sense, because that's the whole point of regulating the art of healing trauma. And I was fortunate enough in that I was partnered at the time with the woman who created these mixed emotions cards. And they were a complete game changer. Her name is Petra Martin. And every client gets a set of those for free. That's how critical they are. And part of this is you don't have to be a psychologist or anything else. I couldn't even label more than a handful of emotions. And most of those, I'm going to say, were the primary emotions. And it's easy to say anger and fear because I lived that way most of my life. And I could put out the image here, but if you've seen some of my other videos, you understand that the emotional, and I sometimes think it's a default set for being in fight flight, is the emotions of fear and the emotions of anger, fighting and fleeing. And they exist on a scale, a spectrum. Then you can look at Plutchik's wheel of emotions, which has its cone really, and the top of the cone or bottom of the cone are the primary emotions from which all of these others emanate. And then you can combine these emotions, and yeah, it gets big. And having more than one emotion all at the same time. What? Oh, yeah, you may have noticed I'm wearing the same sweater. Because it's kind of a gray day outside. That's because I'm making all of these on the same day. It just, oh well. In any event, these mixed emotions cards, Petra had made them, so she gave me a set. And now I give them to all of my clients because they make that big of a difference. There's all kinds of ways to use them. There's an endless, you can make up ways to use these as people have done. It's on her website. But so here's one called inadequate. All right. So you got this little Volkswagen Beetle trying to pull this huge trailer up the hill. Yeah. You ever wonder why Volkswagens don't come with trailer hitches? Now, so that's inadequate. That's one way to feel about that. And then at the bottom, you'll notice there's, oh, yeah, isn't that cool? So inadequate could be a shade of that, could be worthless, incompetent, ill-equipped, which in some cases, okay, it might actually be, at work, I've been in situations in jobs past where ill-equipped was the standard operating procedure. And sometimes tactically you're ill-equipped because stuff rolled over you and or. Anyway, that can actually be a legitimate feeling, as most of this can. Worthless, on the other hand, is not necessarily so. And most of these have to do with how do you feel about yourself. And the reason I say there was an interesting experience here is because as I tremored, this stuff began to come out of me in terms of, now all of a sudden I'm having these feelings, but what are these feelings I'm having? I couldn't label them. Now I can. And then I got to see how Okay, well, what brought that up? What's going on right now? I was able to put it in context. And what does feeling inadequate say? Maybe it really does say about my situation that it is ill equipped. I need to say something about that. When I feel this way about myself, that means there's something that needs to be worked on. Now, okay, cool. Tremoring helps that because boy, this, I could say this is right around the area of shame because it is. Shame can make you feel that way about being an employee, about being a lover, about being a friend, about anything, about being a dad, all those kinds of things. And that's running at our core. So when opportunities come along, guess what we do? Nah, I don't think so. Even though there's this thing inside of you might be saying, yeah, wow, would that be cool? Because you know what? Sometimes I'll say to opportunities, yeah, sure, I'll do that, or I'll try. Doesn't mean I'm ready to, doesn't mean I can't learn to. Because maybe I'll never be adequate enough. If I was adequate enough, the Major League Baseball would be calling me right now and said, hey, we need you at second base. But the only way to get good at second base is to play the position long enough to become adequate. It's magic. You're not born adequate. You make yourself adequate. And when you're afraid, it's hard to do. And so will not be done. And I found that as I moved more in tremoring and in physically moving myself, I had more emotions. I remember once I was teaching a black belt in jiu-jitsu. Yeah, I think it was Brazilian. And so before we start a tremoring session, I like to ask people how they feel, just do an inventory. How do you feel physically? How do you feel emotionally? What's going on in your life cognitively? Where are things at in your life? So socially, the place you live in, all these things. Just take a few seconds, kind of gather your, feel what's going on, be cognizant of it, and then we tremor, and then I ask the question again. And so I asked him, and at the end he said, you see, he's sitting there kind of at the end of a Brazilian class like he would be, uh, I feel the same. And then he decided to sit back. And as he was sitting back, he's going to put his hands behind him and kind of lean back on his hands while his legs are still crossed. So that's opening up his midsection here. As he was moving backwards, I saw his eyes change. Yeah, that's how fast that happens. He noticed it too, because what he noticed was his inner shift. Then he sat back forward again and said, wow, I can't believe that happened. I said, they tend to be tied together and you'll become more. And yeah, I started to get quite a few phone calls from him when he was doing this, when he was doing that, and this happened and that happened. Oh, I started to tremor. One day he called me from his office chair. Yeah, I was trying, and he's telling me about another situation, and he starts to spontaneously tremor in his office chair. Yeah. He said, what's going on? I'm not moving. I said, no, there's somewhat of a connection here that's developing between your emotions and your body, because that's the reality. You are finally touching on the reality that maybe you've never touched on, and stuff that you've been hiding for so long and running away from for so long. Now it's finding its expression. It's completing itself. And sometimes those spontaneous things don't actually complete anything cognitively. The body has its own wisdom. That's for sure. When we begin moving, we will begin feeling. And feeling and emotions go together. A great resource is 6 seconds. It's an organization on emotional intelligence. Another one would be Robert Plutchik's book called Emotions. And I do believe Candace Pert has a book, Molecules in Motion. And I think it's about this, where she discovered that this emotional chemistry that we actually have in our body. What does that mean for me? Well, I am no longer called Mr. Aloof. I've been called rare by the opposite gender 4 times now. I still chuckle about this. One woman said, "You're too evolved." And part of me said, interesting observation. The other part of me kind of chuckled because I had brought up this point of, is tremoring, if this catches on worldwide and we really begin to heal not only people but societies, systems that are so broken, is this evolution's next step for man? He didn't want to go there. Okay. I did at that moment because I thought the interesting observation. As you begin to heal emotionally, now you can be available to spouses, to children, to coworkers, and to friends on a whole new level. A whole new level. So somebody will say, "Hey, go talk to Lecky." Why? Because he gets it. I've had these things said to my face since then. So I'm no longer Mr. Aloof. And then when somebody gets frustrated, you're having this kind of day, that kind of day. Okay. I don't always do this. I'm not always as prescient as I might come across here, but I more often than not say, "Boy, you're really frustrated." And I get to validate their life. I get to validate their frustration. I get to validate that, "Ooh, that was disappointing," or, "Ooh, that must have hurt. Ooh, that's dismissive." Yeah. I'm not always 100% of that. More than I ever was. Nobody would say anymore that I'm aloof. That's for darn sure. Or I'm scared of this stuff. Those are some of the benefits of healing your trauma emotionally. You get to be there for others. And when you find that right mix, that means somebody gets to be there for you. Anyway, see you in the next video. We are going to talk about cognition and healing trauma. Bye.